Okay, so you lead a sales team, and you sent us some really interesting research. Specifically, this study from 2015.
Right.
It's called "Do You Get What You Pay For?" It's by Kuvaas and some other folks.
Yep.
And you know what really caught our eye about this one wasn't just another, theoretical take on how to structure compensation plans.
Right.
It was the fact that these researchers, they followed real sales teams at a real company over 2 years.
Wow.
And they looked at, okay, how do different ways of paying people actually affect what keeps them motivated? How hard they're actually working. And then that big question of whether they stick around or they start looking for the exit.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's what we want to dig into today.
Yeah, I think this study is really valuable because, like you said, it's not just, kind of a one-time snapshot.
Right.
It's really following these people over time.
Yeah, a longitudinal study.
Yeah, and it's also great because it uses real pay data from this insurance company. And this insurance company had two different sales divisions. So one that was doing business-to-business sales and one that was doing business-to-consumer sales.
Got it.
And that gives us a much more practical look at what's actually going on than, some of those broader theories.
Yeah, I mean, that's always the challenge, right?
Exactly.
You read these business books and, they've got these great ideas, but you're like, okay, but in my actual sales team, how does this play out?
Right. Yeah.
So this is real world stuff. And the other thing I think that's interesting here and kind of adds to this richness is that the study is rooted in something called self-determination theory.
Yeah.
Or SDT.
SDT.
And so this is a framework that goes beyond, just that basic idea of, money's the only thing that motivates people.
Right.
It starts looking at, okay, well, what's the quality of that motivation? And SDT, it breaks it down into two main types.
Yeah.
You've got autonomous motivation, which is that, that drive that comes from within someone.
Yeah. They're doing it because they enjoy it or they find it meaningful.
Exactly. They find the work itself rewarding.
Right.
And then on the flip side, you've got controlled motivation, which is much more driven by those external factors. Right? I'm going to get a bonus if I do this, or if I don't hit my quota, something bad's going to happen.
Right. The classic carrot and stick.
Exactly. Yeah. And so in the study, they actually highlight that the insurance company, they had very specific reasons for choosing different variable pay structures for these two different sales teams.
Right.
So the B2B team, they were on an annual bonus system.
Yep.
And the company's thinking there was, this is a longer term sales cycle.
It's about building those relationships.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
So maybe that annual incentive makes sense there.
Makes sense.
And then for the B2C folks who, it's a much shorter cycle, often more transactional.
Right.
They had them on a quarterly variable pay system.
Yeah, they wanted that more, immediate reward.
Yeah.
If you put in the effort, you see the results.
That quick feedback loop.
Yet sometimes they call it instrumentality.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
Where it's like you do this action, you get this outcome.
Yeah, you see that direct connection.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's unpack some of these findings, because when they start comparing base pay to all these different variable incentive structures, there's some stuff here that I think is going to make a lot of sales leaders really, rethink some of their assumptions.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It definitely made me, look at some of my own approaches and go, maybe I need to reconsider how I'm thinking about this.
Yeah, for sure. And one of the things that really jumped out at me was the really strong positive relationship they found between the amount of base pay someone was making and how much effort they said they were putting into their work.
Interesting. So more base pay equals more effort.
Yeah, and on top of that, they found a negative relationship between base pay and people's intentions to leave the company.
Oh, so the more they were making in base pay, the less likely they were to be eyeing the door. Exactly. And here's where it gets really interesting. They tied this back to SDT and said a lot of this is because of that autonomous motivation.
So it's not just, I've got more money in my pocket, I'm happier. It's something deeper going on there.
Right. It's about how that base pay makes them feel.
Okay, so help me understand this. Why do you think base pay had this kind of impact on people's, that internal drive, that autonomous motivation?
Well, the researchers, they suggest that when someone's got a really solid base salary, it's almost like a signal from the organization that, hey, we recognize your worth. We see your value. It's not just tied to, did you hit your quota this month or this quarter?
Right. It's more about the sum total of what you bring to the table.
Yeah, your skills, your experiences, your whole contribution over time.
Your track record.
Exactly. And unlike a bonus, which is, very specific to a certain period, base pay, it's much more stable.
It's that steady foundation.
It's that message that's always there. that we value you.
Yeah, and I can see how, from an employee's perspective, that sends a very different message than, being on that constant, performance treadmill to try to hit those bonus targets.
Right. And the study also suggests that when that base pay is competitive, when it meets or even exceeds what's typical in the market, it can really help satisfy those fundamental psychological needs that SDT talks about.
Okay, so remind me, what are those again?
Sure. So you've got competence. Feeling like, you're good at what you do, that you have the skills to succeed.
Okay.
You've got autonomy, that sense of control and choice in your work.
Right.
And then relatedness, that feeling of connection and belonging.
Like you're part of a team.
Exactly.
Well, so I can see how that base pay, if it hits those marks, it's almost like saying to your employees, we trust you, we respect your expertise, and you're a valued part of this team.
Precisely.
That's a very different vibe than just dangling a carrot in front of them every quarter. So if I'm a sales leader, this is really making me think maybe that strong competitive base salary isn't just, the cost of doing business. It could be one of my most powerful tools to get my people really engaged.
Yeah.
To get them putting in that extra effort and to keep my top performers from jumping ship.
Yeah, it might be even more important than all those fancy variable incentives.
Okay, so base pay, big deal.
Big deal.
Now, what about the variable pay?
Okay, so let's talk about the annual variable pay first.
So that's that once-a-year bonus for the B2B team in the study.
Right, and what they found was kind of interesting. So that annual bonus was definitely linked to controlled motivation. The potential for that big payout definitely got their attention.
Okay.
But here's where it gets a little counterintuitive.
Yeah.
It was also negatively related to their autonomous motivation.
Wait, so the possibility of a big bonus was actually making them less intrinsically motivated?
That's the study suggests.
Yeah. That's so weird. So you're telling me that while the bonus might get them laser focused on hitting those year-end targets,
right,
it could also be making them less passionate about the work itself.
Yeah, it kind of takes the joy out of it.
Wow. And, for someone like me who works with sales teams with those longer, complex sales cycles,
right,
that's something I really need to think about.
Yeah. It's not just about closing the deal. It's about the whole process. There's a relationship building.
Exactly.
And if they're not finding that inherently rewarding, then that could be a problem.
Absolutely. Okay, so the study found this link between annual bonuses and lower autonomous motivation. But how did that actually translate to, how hard they were working?
So they found two indirect pathways to work effort.
Okay.
One was positive, and that was through controlled motivation.
Right, so they're working harder because they want that bonus.
Exactly. But then there's also a negative pathway, and that stemmed from that decrease in autonomous motivation.
So they're less excited about the work itself, so they're not putting in as much effort. Right.
And these two forces were basically canceling each other out.
Yeah, pretty much so. Overall, the impact of the annual bonus on their work effort was kind of muddy.
Interesting. So in terms of, productivity, that annual bonus wasn't really moving the needle that much.
Really?
But what about retention?
No, this is where things get really interesting for sales leaders who are worried about keeping their best people.
Yeah, that's always top of mind for me.
So the annual variable pay, it was linked to an increase in turnover intentions.
An increase?
Yeah. And it was through both of those pathways that we talked about.
Okay, so both the lower autonomous motivation and the higher controlled motivation.
Right. So while that annual bonus might make them focus on hitting their numbers in the short term, it also seems to make them more likely to start looking for other jobs.
That's wild. So that big annual carrot that we dangle to keep our experienced B2B folks happy,
right,
might actually be having the opposite effect and pushing them out the door.
Yeah, it's a real head scratcher. That's a huge insight for anyone who manages sales teams with longer sales cycles.
Yeah, you got to think long term.
Absolutely. All right, so we've talked about annual bonuses. Let's switch gears and talk about those quarterly incentives.
Okay.
How did those play out with the B2C team?
So with the quarterly payouts, they saw some differences there.
Okay.
Similar to the annual bonuses, the quarterly ones were also positively related to controlled motivation.
So people are definitely paying attention to those payouts.
Oh, yeah. But this time, they also found a direct positive relationship between how much they were getting in those quarterly bonuses and how much their work effort increased.
Interesting. So those more frequent rewards, they seem to have a more immediate effect on how hard people were working.
Exactly. It's like that instant gratification.
Makes sense.
And controlled motivation was part of it. But there was also that direct link. More money, more effort.
Okay, but did those quarterly bonuses also have that negative impact on autonomous motivation like we saw with the annual ones?
Surprisingly, no, not really. They didn't find a significant decrease in autonomous motivation with the quarterly incentives.
Huh. That's interesting. Why do you think that is?
Well, it could be that the shorter time frame and that more frequent feedback loop, getting a bonus every quarter, maybe that kept them more engaged without, crushing their intrinsic drive.
Like it's less of a pressure cooker situation.
Right. But here's the thing, just like with the annual bonuses, they found that the quarterly variable pay was linked to an increase in turnover intentions.
Oh, man. So even though it wasn't killing their internal motivation, it was still making them more likely to leave.
Yeah. And again, this was connected to that controlled motivation.
So it's like they're working harder, they're getting those rewards, but they're also feeling more pressure, more stress.
Yeah, it's like they're always chasing the next bonus.
And maybe they're not feeling as valued for, their overall contribution.
Right. They're just a number.
Yeah. So as a sales leader, it's like you're always walking this tightrope, You want to hit those sales targets, but you don't want to burn out your team or have them all quit.
Right. It's a balancing act.
For sure. Okay, so we've talked about base pay, we've talked about annual bonuses, we've talked about quarterly bonuses. What's the big takeaway here?
Well, one of the most surprising conclusions of this whole study was that variable pay, whether it was annual or quarterly, it actually had a less clear and sometimes even negative impact on those key outcomes.
You mean work effort and whether people stayed with the company?
Exactly, compared to the impact of base pay and autonomous motivation.
Wow, so all that emphasis we put on performance-based incentives in sales.
Yeah.
Maybe we've got it all wrong.
It might be time for a rethink. And the study even suggests that how often those payouts happen might be a bigger driver of controlled motivation than how much money's involved.
Really?
Yeah, it's not just about the size of the carrot. It's about how often you're dangling it. And what's even more important for sales leaders to understand is that there's a huge difference in the strength of the relationships.
Okay.
So autonomous motivation was much more strongly linked to positive outcomes, like increased work effort and lower turnover compared to controlled motivation.
So intrinsic motivation really is the key.
It seems like it, yeah.
So all the time and energy we spend designing these super complicated incentive programs, maybe we should be focusing more on nurturing that internal drive within our sales teams.
Right. How do we make the work itself more meaningful and engaging?
Exactly.
Now, the study also briefly touched on some of the potential downsides of relying too heavily on variable pay.
Okay.
They talked about salespeople trying to game the system.
Oh, yeah, like holding back sales until a certain bonus period.
Exactly. Yeah. Or there might be concerns about fairness.
Right. Why did she get a bigger bonus than I did? We both hit our numbers.
Yeah, or, maybe the bonus structure favors certain types of sales or certain territory.
Yeah, I've seen that happen before. It can create a lot of tension on the team.
For sure, and it can even damage relationships with customers.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. If you're just focused on closing the deal to hit your bonus, you're not really thinking about what's best for the customer in the long run.
Exactly.
So as helpful as this study is, it's important to remember that it does have some limitations.
Right.
Like you mentioned earlier, they were relying on self-reported data for things like motivation levels and work effort. So, people aren't always the best judges of their own behavior.
Right.
And there are also some people who didn't complete the follow-up surveys, so we don't have the full picture.
True. And we also have to remember that this research was done at a specific company in Norway. So their culture and their compensation history might be different from what we see in other parts of the world.
Right, so we can't necessarily generalize these findings to every sales team everywhere.
Exactly. But even with those limitations, this study has a lot to offer.
Yeah, it's a longitudinal study with real pay data, so it's definitely more robust than a lot of the research out there.
Definitely. One thing that I found interesting was that they didn't directly measure how well the company was meeting those core psychological needs that we talked about.
You mean autonomy, competence, and relatedness.
Right. Those are key drivers of autonomous motivation. And it would have been interesting to see how they were playing out in this context.
Yeah, that would have added another layer to the finding.
For sure. Okay. So for all the sales leaders out there listening, what are the key takeaways from all of this?
Yeah. What should they be thinking about as they go back to their teams and their comp plans?
All right. So I think there are 3 big points to remember.
Okay.
First, reevaluate the role of base pay. Stop thinking of it as just the bare minimum you have to pay people.
Okay.
A competitive and fair base salary, especially for your top performers. It's the foundation for building that autonomous motivation.
Right. So like you said earlier, it's a signal of their inherent value to the organization.
Exactly. And that can make a huge difference in their drive to succeed and their commitment to the company.
Okay. So base pay as a strategic lever.
Exactly.
What's number 2?
Number 2, be really careful with variable pay.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, performance-based incentives can be useful.
Right.
They can drive that controlled motivation and get you some quick wins.
Yeah.
But they can also backfire. They can undermine autonomous motivation and even increase turnover.
Yeah, it's that double-edged sword.
Right. So you really have to think about the frequency, the structure,
Yeah.
the potential unintended consequences of your variable pay plans.
And are those incentives really aligned with your long-term goals for the team?
Right.
Or are you just creating a culture of chasing short-term wins?
That's the question.
Okay, so base pay is key. Be strategic about variable pay. What's number 3?
Number 3, focus on cultivating autonomous motivation.
That intrinsic drive.
Yeah, think beyond just money.
Okay.
How can you give your team more autonomy in their work?
Mm.
How can you create opportunities for them to develop their skills and grow professionally?
Yeah.
How can you connect to their work to a bigger purpose, to the company's mission?
Right.
And how can you foster a strong sense of belonging and support within the team?
So it's about creating a work environment that people are excited to be a part of.
Exactly.
Where they feel challenged and valued, and where they can see how their contributions are making a difference.
That's the goal.
This has been so insightful. I mean, it really changes the way I'm thinking about compensation and motivation.
I'm glad to hear that.
It's not just about the money. It's about creating a culture where people are intrinsically motivated to do their best work.
Exactly.
So for all the sales leaders listening, what's one thing that you're going to take away from this conversation?
Yeah, what's one aspect of your approach that you might want to reevaluate? Based on what we've discussed today, how can you better foster that autonomous motivation within your team?
That's a great question. Something for everyone to think about.
Yeah.
And if you're interested in learning more about this study or diving deeper into the research on motivation and compensation in sales,
Absolutely.
we encourage you to check out the resources we've linked in the show notes.
Great.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll see you next time.
See you then.